started this year by talking about prayer and fasting. And those are two really, really popular topics, right? Everybody loves fasting. In fact, we've gotten quite a bit of feedback, and some of it was positive. That's kind of the way it goes. But it's always interesting to me when we tackle something like 21 days of prayer. Like we've been doing this, if you're new to Summit, we've been praying together 21 straight days along some guided direction. When we dive into a subject like fasting, it's amazing the ways that people are stretched. There's things that you hear, there's stories that come out and people go, man, I don't like this, or this is challenging me. But at the same time, I'm experiencing this, and there's this new thing that's happening, and I just kind of opened my eyes to this. That's the way it is with risk. Risk is something that you grow from. You learn from certain risks, right? In fact, this week, I was reminded of this in sort of a funny, humorous sort of way. On Monday, I was flying back to Spokane. I had a long Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday of meetings, and I was coming back Monday afternoon, and I go to the Burbank airport down in Los Angeles, and I get on my plane, and it was one of those times where I was just focused on getting home. I didn't really care about what was going on around me, so I got into my seat. I didn't pay attention to the guy that's sitting next to me, It's like I noticed he was kind of fiddling with his stuff, and I was fiddling with my stuff, and then you kind of hit that moment where you're like, oh, I should probably acknowledge him. And so I turn, but right then he puts his headphones in, which is like the international sign for, I don't need a friend for the next 2 hours. And I'm like, yes, we are on the same page. And so I just guilt-free, earplugs in, we're not talking, right? So I'm just sitting next to this guy the whole time, not really paying attention to him. I do notice a couple, he's a little eccentric when the flight attendant's asking what he wants. He's very specific, definitely knows what he wants. I kind of noticed that, but other than that, just an average person there. So we land in Seattle, and then there's that moment where everybody thinks you're gonna get off in 20 seconds, but you're gonna all just stand awkwardly under the luggage thing. So we get to that moment, we're all just kind of, hey, and I'm one of those guys, everyone does it, right? Nobody's smart enough to just sit unless you're in row 27B. But this whole thing happens, and so I'm gathering my stuff, and I'm kind of leaning there, and I'm just you don't make eye contact, by the way. You don't look at the people. It's just you just stand there. So I'm looking at the guy's stuff in the chair, and I notice he has this bright green pleather briefcase bag. And so I'm like, that's interesting. And then I see this tag on it that says British invasion. I'm like, oh, the British are invading us with pleather, apparently. Right about that moment, then I suddenly become a little bit more aware, and I realize that this guy is wearing purple corduroy pants and a brown corduroy shirt. In fact, it was so compelling as I was walking up the jetway, I had to snap a picture. Now, the saddest thing is, I sat next to the guy for 2.5 hours and didn't know that's what he was wearing. I just completely oblivious. What is this? I'm not even aware. So I was captivated by this, it's just Scooby-Doo was the first thing that ran through my head. I was like, what's going on? And in this moment you realize some risks are worth taking, right? And some are not. And purple corduroy is not a risk worth taking, right? Sorry to offend those of you that were maybe dreaming about this. You're I actually think that looks good. It doesn't. We're just going to ruin your dreams right here. But risk is a funny thing. And the reason I point this out is that risk can really not be associated with any particular activity, but risk is really associated with feelings, right? With emotions. And so there are some things, some activities that we deem risky, but sometimes just very simple everyday things if it's getting you out of your comfort zone, if it's stretching you out of the status quo, if it's causing you to do something out of the norm, those things can feel risky, right? You have these emotions, you have these feelings where you go, okay, I'm taking a risk here and I'm stretching myself. When we do that, we learn, we grow through those experiences. Along those same lines, I have this odd obsession with mountains. I just love mountains. I love looking at mountains. I love climbing mountains. I love climbed a small one. Wow, can't hardly talk today. But I climbed a small mountain yesterday. I've climbed big mountains in my life. In fact, this summer, I signed up for some strange reason to climb Mount Kilimanjaro in Africa. With World Vision, we're raising several $1 million to help with some specific projects in East Africa. But I just like to climb mountains. In fact, this morning, I just got a gem of a picture for you this morning because a friend of mine, Scott Martin, took this picture on Mount Adams. And the reason I chose, we're pretty high here. There's no trees or anything, right? The reason I chose this picture is the awkward look on my face. Going through, I was like, wow, I'm not having fun, right? In fact, there's one of two things going through my head that I can remember from this moment. It was either, where am I going to go to the bathroom if there are no trees? That's a very real thing when you're climbing mountains, by the way. It's a very open opportunity for everyone. But the more likely thing I think I'm thinking in this moment is, why? Why do I do this? Like, why? Like, the couch is way more comfortable. Men my age watch football, and they sit on the couch, and they hang out with their friends. Why do I do this? And I have these moments, like every time I've ever climbed a mountain, I have a moment somewhere in the middle of it where I'm like, why am I doing this? This is the dumbest thing I've ever done. Like, this is a risk. Why do I take this? And at the same time, I'm growing in the middle of the risk, right? By the way, everyone I know that ever does this stuff always has that same moment where you question your own sanity. Some of you are questioning mine right now. That's okay. But it's not just me that loves mountains. In fact, one of the things I've noticed is mountains have a sort of lore among humanity. We love mountains. How many of you love mountains? Raise your hand if you love mountains. This is kind of weird, right? Like every service, everybody raise their hands. Like, yeah, I just love them. I love to be in them. I love to see them. I love to look at them. There's a mystique. There's a mystery. There's something that sort of compels us and draws us to mountains. What's also interesting is that mountains have become a metaphor. This risk associated with mountains have become a metaphor. Maybe you've heard somebody say, I had a mountaintop experience. How many of you have heard somebody say that before? I had a mountaintop experience. Now, what are they talking about? What are they actually saying when they say that? Usually, when they use that sort of language, they're describing an encounter that they had. They're describing a moment that they had. They're describing something where they encountered God in a way that was maybe unique than their everyday life. Like there's life and just sort of moving through your days and having your normal experiences. And then there's this moment where suddenly you had an encounter with God and God was different than what you expected. And there was something that happened around you or something that happened in you. And it was this dynamic that was taking place. We describe that by calling it a mountaintop. There was something out of the norm that I experienced with God. And it was powerful. I had a mountaintop experience. Now, what's interesting about this is that metaphor wasn't always a metaphor. When you survey the Bible, in other words, when you take a broad brushstroke look at what's going on in the story of the scriptures, you see this repeated theme. You see that over and over again, these stories of experience with God emerge from the scriptures, and there's a pattern of them that happen over and over again. Like mountains, physical mountains are often reported as places where people have these intimate and dynamic encounters with God, literal mountaintop experiences. So for example, Abraham in Genesis chapter 22, there's this moment that so many people miss, that Abraham goes up on the mountain with his son Isaac, and he thinks he's going to sacrifice his son to a God who's like all other gods. And when he gets into this moment, he discovers that this is a God who is unlike any other God. And this interaction that he has with him is so compelling, and it's so powerful that Abraham has changed forever. In fact, human civilization, the way that human beings think and talk about God is shifted, altered in this moment, and the trajectory is set for what we know today because of this mountaintop experience. Or Exodus chapter 20. Moses is leading the people of Israel through the desert, a bit of a metaphor there in itself, moving through the desert, and then they come to Mount Sinai, and Moses goes up Mount Sinai, and he has this encounter, this experience with God's presence. This experience is so powerful that it literally says when Moses comes down off of the mountain that the people who first saw him said, "You look different." Like you've changed. Your time in the presence of God has actually changed. You look different. You kind of have this glow about you because you've been in the glory of God. Not only that, when Moses comes down from the mountain, if you know the story, he comes down with what? The 10 Commandments, which we sort of take for granted. Like the 10 Commandments, okay, there's this moment where he comes down, here's these 10 things you kind of heard about him when you were a kid, and we don't really talk about him much these days. But these were revolutionary because for the first time in human history, first time in civilization, we now have a code of ethics that helps humanity lean into the dream that God had for them. Like until this point, civilization was sort of running amok, and now the 10 Commandments are this presentation of another way to live. We can live towards God in a meaningful way. We can live with each other in a way that makes sense. There's this dynamic, and so culture, again, shifts, it changes, it moves, it starts to move in the direction that God intended it to move. And so the mountaintop leads to change. 1 Kings chapter 18, Elijah has an encounter with God before all of these false prophets and false gods, and God shows up so powerfully. And again, the culture changes. And so what we see over and over again is this pattern of mountaintop experiences. And maybe you're wondering, okay, what does this have to do with prayer and fasting? What does it have to do with me? Why do we hear about this? Well, my hope, is that we would have powerful personal encounters with God. Like maybe instead of Summit just being a catchy name for a church, what if it actually defined our experience? What if the reason we're the church that we are is because we have these Summit, these mountaintop experiences where we encounter God? What if this was defining the way that we're living? We experience God on the mountain, whether it's in a gathering like this or whether it's maybe in our own time privately. Maybe we actually climb a physical mountain, but we experience Him. So I want to take a few moments. I want to talk about summits. I want to talk about mountaintops for a few minutes. And I realize that I'm going to state the obvious right now, but I think the obvious actually is very illuminating and points to some truths that we need to understand. Here's like obvious truth number one. Obvious truth number one, this is actually the main one. When you climb a mountain, you should also descend a mountain. Right? Like that's sort of the goal. Like that's like we would define success as I went up and I came back down. Like you don't want it to end any other sort of way, right? In fact, my friend Scott Martin, we've climbed several mountains together. He always says at the beginning, remember the summit is the halfway mark. Right? The goal isn't just to get there, the goal is to get down. In fact, interestingly enough, a lot of mountaineering accidents happen on the way down because people are less attentive. They're not thinking about engaging in the same sort of way. Now, this is really interesting because it relates to our relationship with God. In fact, this sheds some light on why some of us seem to malfunction in our faith, if I can use that word. I'm going to explain this from sort of a world religions perspective. And I don't particularly like to compare the faith of Jesus in a comparative religions debate because Jesus, ultimately, what he presents to us is an anti-religion. It's not religiosity. The way that we think of religion, the way we think of behaviors, the way we interpret that, what Jesus presents is actually different. The faith system that he presents is different. But just in the context of global faith systems, Christianity is known as what's called a prophetic faith system, a prophetic religion. This is important if you're a Christian because the alternative to this is what's known as a mystical faith. So you basically have one of two choices. A faith system, a faith construct is either prophetic or it's mystical, and Christianity is prophetic, not necessarily mystical. So let me just explain what this means. Prophetic religions seek to transform the world in God's name. So in other words, they look at the world and they say, we want things to be a little bit different because we know that God has a plan for us that's a little bit better, and so we're going to lean into God's plan for humanity and work with God to make this a better place. Mystic religions seek to flee the world and into God's arms. So they go, hey, the world isn't a very good place, but we're just going to run away and hide from it. Those are the two different options. So prophetic religions transform, mystical religions escape. Let me put it this way. In a mystical religion, it's all about the ascent and the summit. It's all about the mountaintop, right? It's like, man, let's have this euphoric moment. Let's experience emotions and let's have this like real connection and experience intimacy and then let it be so good that maybe we could just camp out here for a while. Let's just live in this sort of mystical space. But in a prophetic faith, there's an ascent. There might be an encounter at the summit, but there is also this return. So yes, something happens on the mountain. Something powerful takes place, but it doesn't stay there. There's a return. There's a prophetic vision for the world. There's a way that things could be like the 10 Commandments. Like when I come down from this place, things might be a little bit different in me and around me. So Abraham goes up and he comes down different. Moses comes up and he comes down different. And we begin to see this rhythm of ascent and return. You ascend, you encounter God, and then you return in a different way to live with the people that are around you. So the ascent It's this point in which the person of faith has this authentic encounter with God and they receive something. They receive a message. Their identity is reshaped. Their understanding of the world is informed. Their perspective changes. They receive something. And then in the return, they re-engage life and they begin to embody whatever it was they experienced. So I had this encounter with God, and it impacted me so dynamically that now the way that I work, the way that I play, the way that I think about my resources, the stuff I use my time on, all this stuff sort of shifts and changes because of these encounters that I'm having. There's ascent and there's return. If you don't have the ascent, if you don't have the encounter with God, you have nothing to receive. So you need that. But if you don't have the return, there's no engagement in reality. So together, this idea of ascending and returning, it sort of develops this heartbeat, this rhythm that is at the center of Christianity. You ascend and then you return. You ascend and you return. You engage with God and then you live your life. And there's this rhythm of going between these two spaces. Are you with me? Okay. So there's this story in the New Testament that maybe you've heard before, and you go, I don't even know where this fits into the larger scheme of things. Like, what is going on in the New Testament? It's Luke chapter 9. If you have a Bible, you can turn there. But Luke chapter 9, here's the context. Jesus is teaching his disciples, and what he's telling them is about all the stuff that's going to happen around his crucifixion and his resurrection. And he's kind of describing things ahead of time. They don't get it fully. They don't understand. Only later would they go, that's what Jesus was teaching us about. So he's teaching them this stuff for about 7 or 8 days, and then in Luke chapter 9, Jesus decides he's going to take a little field trip with the disciples. And so he approaches 3 of them. He approaches John, he approaches James, and he approaches Peter. And he says, hey, I want you to go with me on a little field trip. And guess where they go? On top of a mountain, right? So they're going to go up a mountain. And we read this in verse 28. It says, now about 8 days after these sayings, he took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And as he was praying, the appearance of his face was altered, and his clothing became dazzling white. And behold, 2 men were talking with him, Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and those who were with him were heavy with sleep, but when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the 2 men who stood with them. And as the men were parting from him, Peter said to Jesus, Master, it's good that we're here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah, not knowing what he said. And as he was saying these things, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. And a voice came out of the cloud saying, this is my son, my chosen one, listen to him. When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent and told no one in those days anything of what they had seen. So Jesus invites them to pray on the mountain. And they have a fairly incredible moment. Would you agree? Like, this is fairly remarkable, right? Like, this is powerful, incredibly powerful. Yes, it's mysterious. Yes, it's mystical. They are seeing things and they are learning things, by the way. I have never had a mountaintop experience like this, just for the record. So if you're like, I want one of those, I haven't had one yet, but they've had it, right? But I want you to notice Peter's response. He says, it's good that we're here. Let's just build some tents and hang out for a while. And did you catch this? Like, he's basically saying this, let's just settle into this moment. Like, guys, this is so good, but we're here. Like, this is it. Let's just camp right here. Let's just live in this experience. Let's just be present in this moment. Let's preserve this moment. Let's do that. And what that reveals is that Peter's all about what? The ascent, right? He's all about the high. He's all about the experience. I love that Luke adds this little bit to this, not knowing what he had said. Basically, that's like, for anyone who has ever let words come out before you thought about them, and then followed that with your foot in your mouth, which, by the way, I feel that way a lot. That's what he's talking about. Like, looking back, he looks back, oh man, like, he obviously didn't know what he was saying. Like, that was the dumbest thing he could have ever said, right? Like, Peter, just shut up. Just be quiet, right? So what do we see? Why is this important? Well, there are people today that say they have this dramatic personal encounter with God. Man, I had this meaningful moment. I had this powerful encounter. But in the middle of this, they actually miss the point. It's all about the encounter. It's all about the experience. And in doing that, they almost become consumers of God. Like, we turn this entire relationship into a consumer-driven relationship, right? Like, I went to this church, or I went on this retreat, or I had this encounter, and it was just so powerful, and this thing kind of happened to me. And it's all about the experience that they had, and they missed the rhythm part of this. They missed the point of the return. In fact, I think this is a source of frustration for some people in their own faith. They're like, yeah, I had this experience and then nothing. Or I actually think there are people outside of faith, some who are more skeptical of the story of Jesus, and some of maybe that's you, maybe you're here, and that's the way you think about this. I think there's some frustration around this where you see Christians, these people who go and have these encounters, maybe they go to a service and they have this emotional encounter, and it sounds really good, and they talk about how meaningful it is, and then they just sort of like go on with life, and it doesn't look any different. Like, then what? When these disciples come down the mountain, in fact, if you read the same account in Mark chapter 9, so Luke chapter 9, Mark chapter 9, same story. In Mark chapter 9, Jesus actually looks at the disciples, these three guys, and he goes, hey, listen, I don't want you to tell anybody about this until after I've resurrected. Now, do you think in that moment they were like, okay, we're going to forget about this. Jesus, we're going to forget we're going to this is going to be like a regressive memory, and we're not going to let this come out. We're just going to like hide this. No, you know that there were probably 15 times that Peter himself was like, dude, I got to tell you guys what happened on that. Never mind, right? Just like he backed off, right? There's so many times when they would think like, I can't wait for the day we get to tell this story. And knowing that, they would have been living differently. Coming off of that mountain, do you think Peter, John, and James, do you think they maybe saw the world a little differently? Do you think maybe they listened to the words of Jesus a little more clearly? Do you think their own marching orders for their lives were shifted because of this? Absolutely. There's an ascent, and then there's this return. So our hope, and the reason that we talk about things like prayer and fasting, the reason we engage in things like 21 days of prayer, we start some of the classes we've started around discipleship and knowing Jesus, isn't so that we just have a dynamic experience by itself, but so that we become people who live the rhythm. We engage. We develop these patterns so we live this kind of life and we make a difference. Now, let me just share with you, there's a principle that I've come to realize in my own life as it relates to this, and I want to share it. Here's what I've learned. Mountaintop experiences, these sort of encounters with God, they emerge out of regular spiritual disciplines that I've established in my everyday life. Let me just say it this way. This is what I've noticed. If I want to have a mountaintop experience, I have to create patterns or opportunities in which I get out of the crazy of everyday life and actually listen to God. So sometimes I hear people say, I never experience God. Like, I never hear from God. Like, I really don't have, like, I don't know what that means. You guys talk about this stuff, but I don't know what it is. And when I hear that, sometimes I wonder, is that because you're just sort of hanging around the bottom of the mountain and you're never climbing to the top? I wrote something this week that came out this morning when I read it. I was like, this is way more negative than I wanted it to sound. But it was too late. My notes were already turned in. So I'm going to give you the negative, and you guys all love and trust me enough to know that I was being kind of positive when I said this. But this is the way I was thinking about this. Don't expect God to show up in your life in dramatic ways if you don't show up before him in faithful, consistent ways. Does that make sense? Like, we just got to show up in front of God in some consistent ways. Like, we just need to be there. Like, don't expect him to just suddenly be there. Like, climbing a mountain takes consistent, deliberate action over and over again in the same direction. Like, that's something that in our microwave culture bristles against us. Like, I'm going to actually have to stay the course. It doesn't just happen instantly. Like, some of us, we want the gondola ride to the top of the God experience and then back down, right? It was just like I had this amazing thing, and now here I am, and everything's different. But getting to the top takes consistent, deliberate action, moving foot over foot, step after step. And maybe the reason the mountaintop metaphor has hung with us for so many years is because it doesn't just describe the experience at the top, but it also describes the way in which we get there. There's effort involved in getting there. So let me just give you some descriptors of what happens when we do. 3 things that are true of the ascent and the return. In other words, when we encounter God, what should we expect? 3 things. First, that this mountaintop experience should involve your mind. It should involve our minds. These 3 things should be present every time. I believe wholeheartedly that Jesus does not ask us to check our brains at the door. Amen? In fact, what I've experienced time and time again is that intellect is very much a part of encountering God. Like, we encounter God through our intellect. You learn something new about who he is. You learn something new about who you are. You learn something about the culture that you live in. Your eyes are opened. You're illuminated. There is an intellectual dynamic in this. In fact, over and over again, we see the writers of the Bible, they use phrases like God giving us wisdom or giving us knowledge or giving us understanding. And that last one's always funny to me because it sounds really profound. Lord, give me understanding. But when you think about understanding, that's like the most basic means of just like, okay, I get it, right? Like, God, let me just get it. God, give me understanding. Help me to quit being so confused all the time. Sometimes he just removes the confusion and touches our minds. We just suddenly see things much more clearly. Like when you go to a summit, you climb through the trees and you can't really see much, but when you break out and you look out on the horizon, everything is sort of in place. You see in a way that is whole and complete. You have understanding of the geography that's around you. When we have mountaintop experiences with God, intellectually, oftentimes, we have understanding of the geography around our own lives. So it starts with that. Secondly, it involves your emotions. We are emotional people. I'm telling some of you this because you don't think you are, but you are. Some of you are too emotional, and you don't think you're too emotional, but you are too emotional, right? But we're all emotional. In fact, Sherry and I, we have these conversations all the time. For years, she'll say, you're more emotional than me, and I'll say, no, you're more emotional than me. And we've just agreed to disagree. We just know we're both emotional at some level, and I think it varies based on how much I've had to eat. But I want you to just think about this. When you're sitting with somebody, they go, hey, how are you? Like, tell me about your state. Tell me about your condition. We use words like this. We use words like happy or depressed or content, anxious, peaceful, angry, determined, lazy. I feel lazy. Notice that all of those words are how we feel, right? We feel certain ways. When we describe our state, we describe that state with words that describe how we feel, our orientation towards the things around us. Now, if the way that we feel, if these things are impacting the decisions that we make, if they're impacting the choices that we're choosing every single day, they're guiding the steps of our lives, wouldn't it make sense that when we encounter God in a meaningful way, that he would impact and touch our emotions, that there would be an emotional component to encountering God that would shift the way that we're feeling. So we're suddenly made aware of God's largeness. We see God's power. We see God's majesty. But at the same time, maybe we see God's grace and we experience God's love. And maybe there's this moment where we realize that he loves us and he suddenly becomes near to us and we experience his closeness. And in that closeness, there's this thing that suddenly happens to us. Something that shifts, something that moves, and we suddenly feel like, oh man, maybe I really am loved. And that begins to change the way that we feel about other stuff. I know this to be true. I've never had an authentic encounter with God and walked away feeling guilt and shame. You ever notice this? Like, you might go into it feeling guilt and shame. That's happened plenty of times in my life. But I've never spent time in God's presence and walked away feeling shame and guilt. You know what I feel? Love, acceptance, and forgiveness. Every time I'm loved, I'm accepted, I'm forgiven. Every time I spend time in God's presence, no matter what I bring to the table, there's this thing that happens. And when I experience that, something moves inside of me. This encounter, something changes, and I move into my day a little differently than I started my day. Recently, I was watching an interview, and I really hate to admit this, but I'm going to. It was Oprah, and it was just because she was interviewing somebody that I really like. There's a Catholic priest that I enjoy in particular, and so she was interviewing this guy. I think it's on YouTube somewhere. It never aired on TV. But I was watching this, and she was asking him about his spiritual rhythms. Like, how much time do you spend praying and meditating on Scripture? And I'll never forget watching this interview with him. He just looked at her and he said, as long as it takes. And it just kind of puzzled her. You could see the confusion. She kind of cocked her head and said, explain that. What do you mean? He said, there's a moment in which we understand that God is near us and that he loves us and that he's close to us. And he said, sometimes there are days when I just experience that in an instant. And then there are times it might take hours before I ever know it. But that's what I'm looking for. It's not about time. It's about knowing God and moving into my day. That's what this is about. We move into God's presence, we experience him. It doesn't just stay there, though. It doesn't just stay with the emotion, doesn't just stay with the intellect. It moves to the will. It changes the way that we move. Remember, Christianity is a prophetic faith. God has hopes for humanity. He has a hope that we would flourish on every level, and he invites us to participate in this, not just personally. Yes, personally, there's an impact. By the way, when you spend time with God, hopefully you come out of that and you actually love the people around you a little bit better, right? Maybe you actually have some patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control. Maybe some of those things are present when you do this, but he also hopes that we would influence the world around us so that other people flourish as well. which means this: God is not content with us just having an intellectual moment or an emotional moment and then just bouncing to the next one. He wants us to return. He wants there to be something different about the way that we're moving. And so we come off of the mountain, and not only are we impacted, but so is the world around us. So personal change, public change, we actually live differently. Remember, that's the pattern with Abraham, with Moses, Elijah, the disciples. They experience God, and then they're different. This is, by the way, is why I believe the gospel is the hope of the world. I know some people believe in all sorts of other things, like politics. That's really the hope of the world. I believe the gospel does more to change people's lives and to change our culture than anything else. It's why I love the local church, because it delivers the gospel generously. That's what I believe. I believe that when you and I have encounters with God's grace and love, it shifts something in us. But I want you to notice something. In fact, this morning we're going to take communion together in a few minutes. And this sacrament of communion that Jesus instituted with his disciples, there's a pattern that it follows that also follows the pattern of these mountaintop experiences. And I just want you to notice the way this works. That on the mountaintop experience, yes, there is some effort in getting to the mountaintop, but it is God who reveals himself to us. It's God who says, "This is who I am." We simply respond to God showing us who he is and who we are. And then out of that response, out of seeing God, out of seeing his love and his grace and his goodness, there is a response to that. We see him, and then we begin to live our lives out of response to that. That's the way this works. God reveals himself. Our emotions are touched. Our will is impacted. It is never reversed. In fact, what Jesus is giving us is the reversal of the way most people think. It is not religious behavior that allows us to encounter God and then be changed. It is simply that God says, "Do you see who I am? And do you see how I love you?" And then will you live impacted by that love? So Jesus has a final Passover meal with his disciples. And at the end of this meal, he takes the bread and he breaks it and he says, I want you guys to do something. I want you to understand something. I want you to have something you can hold on to. He said, "This is my body that's broken for you." And he takes the cup and he says, "This is my blood that's poured out for you." A new covenant, a new deal between God and humanity. And he says, I want you to continually take this cup and I want you to take this bread and I want you to partake in them. I want you to hold them. I want you to participate in them. And I want you to remember them as symbols. This is who I am. This is how I love you. This is who you are in my eyes. And I believe right there in that moment, what Jesus instituted was a way for you and I to meet God on the mountain every time we do this. And so I'm going to invite the ushers forward to distribute the bread and the cup. They're both in 2 cups there, so make sure you take them both out. And I'm just going to ask that you take some time to reflect on this. The band's going to sing, and if you'd like to join them and sing, that's great. But if you just want to sit and simply reflect and say, what does this say about who God is? What does this say about who I am? What does this say about the world that I live in? And maybe in this moment, God might meet us and transform our hearts. Sound good? So if you'll hold the cups, if you'll hold the bread and the cup, I'll come back up in a couple of minutes, and then we'll take the communion together as a congregation.
Are you hurting and broken within? Overwhelmed by the weight of your sin? Jesus is calling. Have you come to the end of yourself? Do you thirst for a drink from the well? Jesus is calling. Oh, come to the altar. The Father's arms are open wide. Forgiveness was brought with the precious blood of Jesus Christ. Leave behind your regrets and mistakes. Come today, there's no reason to wait. Jesus is calling. Bring your sorrows and trade them for joy. From the ashes, a new life is born. Jesus is calling. Oh, come to the altar. The Father's arms are open wide. Forgiveness was bought with the precious blood of Jesus Christ. Oh, come to the altar. The Father's arms are open wide. Forgiveness was bought with the precious blood of Jesus Christ. Oh, what a Savior. Isn't He wonderful? Sing hallelujah. Christ is risen. Bow down before Him, for He is Lord of all. Sing hallelujah. Christ is risen. Oh, what a Savior. Isn't He wonderful? Sing hallelujah. Christ is risen. Bow down before Him, for He is Lord of all. Sing hallelujah. Christ is risen. Oh, come to the altar. The Father's arms are open wide. Forgiveness was bought with the precious blood of Jesus Christ. Oh, come to the altar. The Father's arms are open wide. Forgiveness was bought with the precious blood of Jesus Christ. Oh, what a Savior. Isn't He wonderful? Sing hallelujah. Christ is risen. Bow down before Him, for He is Lord of all. Sing hallelujah. Christ is risen. Oh, come to the altar. The Father's arms are open wide. Forgiveness was bought with the precious blood of Jesus Jesus Christ. Oh, come to the altar. The Father's arms are open wide. Forgiveness was bought with the precious blood of Jesus Christ.
You know, Jesus invited those that follow him to take the bread and the cup, and I think that it's a powerful reminder. For me, every time we do this, there's just some simple phrases that play through my mind, and one is this, that this planet, humanity, me, is so broken that this was necessary. But at the same time, God is so loving and so forgiving, so accepting, that this is what he would do. That he would send his son to a cross on our behalf so that we could know him. And that one reality just changes everything in my mind and in my heart, and then in the way that I see all of you and the way that I move through my days. And that's, I believe, what Jesus was hoping for when he said, take and eat and drink in remembrance of me. So let's join together and let's eat and drink in remembrance of Jesus. Would you guys stand with me? There'll be some folks after the service available to pray with you. We actually believe in prayer. We think it really matters. And so if you want to pray with someone, or you just have something on your heart, you want to talk with somebody, get some coaching on something, they're always available for that. But as you go into this week and into the world in which you live, as you return, may you encounter God on the mountaintops. And may he touch your mind, and may he change your emotions, and may he shape your will, and may you make a difference in the places where you live and breathe and do life. Amen? Amen. Love you guys so much. Thanks for being here today. We'll see you guys next Sunday. Kicking off a new series next week. It should be really great. See you later.